You've all read this play before, right? I mean, most of you have read this play before. Let's start with a remark about the chorus. I think the strangest thing about the chorus is that for, 10 to 20 years, they never said anything about Laius's death. And this, despite the fact that a stranger who looks rather like Laius comes to Thebes maybe 1 to 2 days after Laius is slain and marries his wife. Now, in the Stasimon at line 462 following, right after Tiresias has charged Oedipus with killing Laius and with incest, they simply ignore the incest charge. So this chorus is remarkably able to ignore things. They never seem to notice anything. Who are they again? They're a chorus of elders who speak for the laos, the people. But also, I mentioned last time, this word can mean the audience. So they speak for the people, but do they perhaps as well speak for us? Is it characteristic of us in the audience also not to notice? Sophocles constructs a play that seems to hold together, but it has certain insurmountable plot problems. Does this faze us at the beginning? We sail right past them. So Sophocles makes us experience a certain incoherence in how things seem that we proceed to ignore. He makes us like the chorus in that we don't actually demand that things make sense. So now, this power of seeming, of doxa, word means opinion on the one hand, and it comes from the verb dokein that means to seem. It's in a way the underlying theme of the play. That Sophocles has something like this in mind is hinted at line 896, when we get this. It's at the end of the strophe at the bottom of the page. When such deeds are held in honor, why should I honor the gods in dance or by dancing? The verb there is choreoein, and it's what choruses do. It's what the word chorus comes from. So choreoein as a verb makes sense here only in their role as chorus. So it looks as though this word allows them to momentarily break the illusion and remind us that it is an illusion. You could say they remind us that it's only by overlooking certain things, we have this fancy phrase for it, the suspension of disbelief, only by that we're taken into the world of drama, where, in this drama, ironically, we learn how dangerous it is to overlook things and suspend your disbelief. So there are several connected things in the Oedipus Tyrannus. On the one hand, his inability to speak metaphorically. I'll pursue the murder of Laius as though Laius were my father. On the other hand, the chorus's utter inability to notice inconsistencies. And then our position as audience of this play. there'll be other things that'll come in later, but I would like to try to see if we can connect these issues today. First, I think we'll start with Oedipus's exchange with Tiresias. Starts at about line 276. Oedipus and the chorus talk about the coming of Tiresias starting at 276. The best of all situations, we're told, would be for the gods to reveal the killer of Laius. But though the gods obviously see everything, you can't make them do anything. And so the second best alternative would be to ask Tiresias, who sees, we're told, what Lord Apollo sees. So ask a man who sees like a god, and that's the next best thing. Oedipus tells them, well, I've anticipated that. On Creon's advice, I've already sent a messenger to get Tiresias. Third best, we're told, would be to examine the old faint words. Epe is the plural of the word epos. Epe in the plural can also mean epic, as in Homer's Iliad or Homer's Odyssey. That's at line 291. Examine the old faint epe. Oedipus says, I look at every word, not every epos, but every logos. And the difficulty here is, and here the text, your translator is amending, changing the text, and then translating the change because it seems so bizarre to him. But the text ought to read, where is it? At 293, line 293. Your translation has, I heard that too, but no one saw the killer. It's really, literally, this is right after he says, I look at every word. So let's look at every word as he tells us we should. No one sees the one who saw. So first interpretation of that is we need a witness to back up the rumors. Literally, though, it's even more peculiar because it would be something like no one sees the one seeing. If you can't see the seeing, on the one hand, no one sees the one seeing means no one saw a witness. We need a witness. On the other hand, it looks as though you might interpret it to mean you can't see your own seeing, and therefore there's no perfect self-awareness. It would be interesting if Oedipus said that, and once again didn't understand the significance of what he had said. But Tiresias comes. So what does he ask Tiresias? Line 310 through 315, we get this. Do not begrudge us oracles from birds or any other way of prophecy. Within your skill, save yourself and the city, save me. That's a little peculiar. Save yourself, save the city, save me. It does look as though the me there is a kind of extra, a sort of spurious third. You don't really need it. If it saves the city, it ought to save Oedipus. So this is Oedipus once again as a spurious third. And then we get, redeem the debt of our pollution that lies on us because of this dead man. We are in your hands. Tools are most nobly or beautiful, are most noble or beautiful when one serves with what he has and to the extent he is able. This is Oedipus' statement of what you might call the religion of public service, of which he's the chief priest and the chief worshiper as well. So the first exchange with Tiresias goes something like this. Tiresias opens by saying, alas, how Denos, how canny / uncanny, how terrible, how clever, is thinking when it brings no profit to the one who thinks. This I knew well, but had forgotten it, else I would not have come here. So Tiresias calls thinking terrible when it doesn't profit the one who thinks. If thinking is terrible when it doesn't profit the one who thinks, then it's a way of calling into question whether it's possible to be altogether selfless. If you can't think without thinking something that's of profit to you, then it looks as though selflessness would be problematic. Selflessness is problematic, then Oedipus's whole view of who he is problematic. Now, Oedipus responds by saying, what is this? How athumos you are, now you have come. How spiritless, sure, but also without thumos, without anger. So there's some connection, apparently, between anger, which Oedipus prizes, and pure thinking, which Oedipus thinks it's possible for him to do. We always want to remember the parting of three ways. It looks as though that has something to do with disinterested thinking. Tiresias has said, in a way, you can't have disinterested thinking. Oedipus has implied, oh, yes, you can. You just look like somebody who doesn't have anger. So without quite realizing it, he's associating anger with the assertion that it's possible to think in a selfless way. And at the same time, we think constantly of Oedipus, the man who always understands this event, this crucial event, to have happened at a parting of three ways and not a fork in the road. Oedipus then accuses Tiresias of being unlawful and not friendly to the polis. So it looks as though the polis, the city, is what makes the sense of selfless service possible. When Tiresias refuses to help, Oedipus gets angry. This is at 3:30 following. He says at 3:35, you would anger the nature of a stone. So he can see only one reason why Tiresias would withhold what he knows, which would be helpful to their attempt to discover who the killer is. At lines 345 through 49, you get this. Is that what I want? Hold on. Yeah. Indeed, I am so angry I shall not hold back a jot of what I think. For I would have you know, I think you were a complotter of the deed and doer of the deed, save insofar as for the actual killing. Had you had eyes, I would have said alone you murdered him. So it never occurs to him that the good of the city might sometimes require incomplete devotion to the city, to the polis, incomplete truth. In a way, I think the whole exchange is designed as a test, designed in a way by Tiresias, as a test to see if Oedipus can understand this. But he can only see his own public spiritedness. That's how he shows his selfishness. At line 362, there's this wonderful ambiguity. Hard to translate this line. It's yours that begins, I say you are the murderer of the king. It's harder than that. I say you are the murderer of the man whom you seek to find. And it looks as though it can have two meanings. Oedipus is the killer he seeks, or Oedipus is the killer of the man he seeks, which ultimately means the killer of himself by seeking himself so thoroughly. After this comes Oedipus's long accusation of Tiresias, lines 380 through 403, and the accusation of Creon as well. He says the two of them seek tyranny understood in terms of greed. So that's not as obvious in your translation. I want you to look at line 380 where it says wealth, sovereignty. That should be tyranny. Next page, if you are king, Tiresias' first line, it should be if you are tyrant. If you go to line about 448, no, actually that's, well, it may as well change it. I tell you, king, that's just not there. I tell you, this man, this murderer. If you look at line 543, try to hunt down tyranny without the people or friends. And I think there may be more, but yeah, there's one more I want to give you. At line 588 or so, I was not born with such a frantic yearning to be tyrant, but to do what tyrants do. And then later down, about 5 down lines later, but if I were the tyrant myself, I must do much that went against the grain. So you really ought to be more careful when you're dealing with the title of a play, not to play so fast and loose with the term. So he accuses them of seeking to overthrow him, to gain the tyranny, and the motive for that he understands is greed. He, on the other hand, understands himself to be altogether selfless. Tiresias has two replies to this. In the first reply, he accuses Oedipus of tyranny, line 408. Oedipus has eyes, but does not see where he is, line 413. He denies his private longings rather than neutralizing them by seeing what they are. In the second speech, just one remark, lines 447 to 48, let's read it. At the beginning, what I came here to say, not fearing your countenance. Oh, I have said what I came here to say, not fearing your countenance. So, despite the fact that when he came in, he said he didn't want to speak, he now says that he has said what he came to say. This is what I meant by saying he lays a trap. It looks as though he only feigned not wanting to speak. He arranges it so that Oedipus causes the revelation through his anger, and therefore isn't the victim he seems at first to be, but in some way brings it upon himself. At the same time, it was what Tiresias came to say. So anger, in a way, has something to do with making what's necessary seem voluntary. Rousseau has a wonderful example in the first book of Emile. I think it's the first book, might be the second book, where, thinking about anger, he talks about, walking along and hitting your foot on a stone. And the pain is obvious, but it's interesting that it's accompanied, frequently you say things like, God damn it. And, you're really literally calling down the curse of God on this poor stone that didn't really intend to hurt you, didn't intend any at all. It's only a stone. But we tend to animate the things that hurt us, because that allows us to get angry at them. You can't get angry at necessity. It has to feel voluntary in order for you to get angry at it. And in a way, that's a relief, because in a world where harm is intentional, at least the world makes sense. But if you're just subject to random acts of, they're not acts, random accidents that hurt you, the world looks as though it doesn't make sense. In a way, you'd rather be hurt by someone who wants to hurt you than to be hurt randomly by something that doesn't actually think about you at all. You just wander through your life and get hurt constantly, but there's no meaning to it. So we swear at inanimate objects. We animate them for the sake of making our lives make more sense. And that's connected to anger. After this conversation with Tiresias, we get the first stasimon. Now, the context is that Tiresias has just finished his awful charge about Oedipus, and on the other hand, Oedipus had just finished replacing the gods' curses with his own curses before Tiresias came in. So the stasimon is, in a way, a response to both of these things. In the first strophic pair, we get a description of an imagined description of the current plight of the murderer. And in the second strophic pair, there are only two in this stasimon, we get the chorus's refusal to accept Tiresias's prophecy and their explanation for why they don't accept it. So, a couple of things. The first pair indicates their complete confidence in the gods to punish the murderer, even if the murderer is invisible to them. He's not invisible to the gods, and the gods will punish. But this is clearly at odds with their rejection of what the gods say through Tiresias in the second strophic pair. So how do they resolve it? They see what Oedipus did, and they're not willing to let what they see be overruled by what they don't see. The gods are invisible. Because they're invisible, they're unknowable. And therefore, one man's interpretation of the gods is as likely as the next man's interpretation. So they're interesting, like Oedipus in this regard. For them, seeing is believing. But we need to see this reasoning is really extraordinarily self-serving. It's really not reasoning, it's rationalizing. It comes into play only because they want something to be true. This is what connects this section to what follows it, the conversation, the episode in which Creon comes back to defend himself against the charges that Oedipus has leveled against him. Look at his first speech, 513 following. I'm going to change one little thing at the beginning. He doesn't just say citizens, he says, citizens, men, I have come because I heard deadly words spread about me that the king accuses me. I cannot take that from him. If he believes that in these present troubles he has been wronged by me in word or deed, I do not want to live on with the burden of such a scandal on me. The report injures me doubly and most vitally, for I'll be called a traitor to my city and a traitor also to my friends and you. The word for friends there, philoi, can also be used to mean kin. So he claims a double injury. It looks as though that injury implies, the doubleness of that injury implies a split between the city and its citizens on the one hand, and his friends, his kindred, those whom he holds dear on the other hand. So for Creon, there are two things. There's public opinion and there's private friendship. And he begins by addressing them doubly, andres, men, and politai, citizens. They have a double designation. Reminds us of the first time we saw him when he came back from Delphi, and Oedipus says, well, what's the report? And Creon says, well, you want to hear it here, or do you want to hear it inside, privately? He makes a distinction immediately, virtually the first thing he does, between public and private. And Oedipus says immediately, that's a distinction that doesn't make any difference to me. I don't make the distinction between public and private. Now, the same issue comes out at 528 through 31. The Creon says, were his eyes straight in his head? Was his mind right when he accused me in this fashion? So did he see clearly and did he think clearly? And they're not the same thing for Creon. Seeing isn't the same thing as understanding. The chorus reply is quite beautiful, for they say, I do not know, oida, which I think I mentioned last time. It's a verb that originally means, it comes from the verb to see. And it's the perfect tense of the verb to see. To know is to have seen. So Creon says, did he see clearly? Did he think clearly? And they say, I don't know, but I don't know means at the same time, I have not seen. And so they collapse seeing and thinking into one word. Now compare this with Oedipus's speech at 532 following. You, sir, how is it you come here? Have you so much brazen-faced daring that you venture in my house, although you are proved manifestly, emphanos, apparently, out in the open, the murder of that man, and though you tried openly highway robbery of my tyranny? So, everything is manifest, emphanos, in the light. Now, of course, that's true only if everything that is open, public, manifest. Only if that's true could seeing be identical to knowing. Now, the exchange that follows indicates that everything can't be manifest. What's at stake in this conversation is whether Creon can defend himself against the charges that Oedipus has brought against him. But Oedipus's charges are based on inferences. Regardless of whether Creon is guilty or innocent, and the evidence for his innocence is pretty good, he cannot be what Oedipus says he is. Oedipus says, you are manifestly bad. Now, if Creon were manifestly bad, then Oedipus wouldn't have trusted him for 10 years to be his co-ruler. He can't be manifestly bad. If he's bad, he's got to be hiddenly bad or immanifestly bad. Now, Oedipus is clearly very proud of his complete fairness, his complete lack of favoritism. That comes out at line 551. And you are wrong if you believe that a criminal will not be punished only because he is my kinsman. But you cannot pay too much attention, I think, to what he says at line 577. Creon had just said, you know yourself whether he said this, but I demand that I should hear as much from you as from me. And Oedipus says, then hear, I'll not be proved a murderer. His fairness has unwittingly become a cloak for his selfishness. Now, the rest of the section highlights this issue. Creon's whole defense depends on the distinction between what's visible, what's public, and what's invisible, what's private. He says he doesn't care about the public. The private is the true motive. And when he accuses Oedipus at line 606 of convicting him on the basis of invisible speeches, he implies that Oedipus has some private motive. Similarly, when Jocasta comes in, she accuses them of placing their private concerns above the needs of the city, and she tells them to be quiet and go inside the house. Oedipus's language betrays why he simply can't understand this at line 612 when he says, "He's right, Jocasta, for I find him plotting with knavish tricks against my person," where in the Greek the word person can sometimes mean this, but really what it means, soma, is body. For Oedipus, the person is the body, is what is apparent, is what's out in the open. So we begin to get a picture of him as the man with no split between public and private. He is the city. But this isn't possible, since to be human is to have a private part. So we're led to the conclusion that Oedipus is a man for whom the public is somehow the private, and that that's in some way the connection to the question of his characteristic feature, his anger. And that the lack of the private is, in some sense, the real meaning of this, the three-way, two-way, the parting of three ways versus the fork in the road problem. So let's start to pull some things together. On the one hand, we have Oedipus as in some way the city, the polis, the utterly public-spirited man who identifies himself altogether with the city and can't make a distinction, thinks he can't make a distinction between public and private. And then we have the Oedipus as the man who can't speak metaphor. His world is the surface. It's what he sees. He doesn't acknowledge the invisible, the inside. And then we have Oedipus, the angry man. And then we have Oedipus as the man who commits incest and parricide. What's the connection? Let's start with the anger. Ordinary anger seems almost always to involve a frustrated desire. You want something. The desire is thwarted. You resent the fact that it's thwarted, that you can't overcome this incapacity to get what you want. Now, frequently this leads in an interesting direction. The desire was the origin, to be sure, but pretty soon resentment replaces desire in terms of what's important to you. Anger is something like a desire to win. It needs an issue to arouse it, but the issue is really only an excuse for it. And yet once aroused, anger tends to feed off itself. So anger has something to do with my desire not to be ruled. You can't do that to me. It has the spirit of, you can't do that to me. Now, you can't do that to me shows itself as the desire to rule others, to make sure they can't do that to you. There's a connection between anger and a longing for tyranny, an attempt to be you're angry at the fact that you're not in control. The desire to be utterly in control to be utterly autonomous, you could say, is connected to a longing to make sure that these beings who get in your way, whom you personify in order to make sense out of your world, to make it a meaningful world, that means that they become your enemies once personified, and it built into anger is a desire to control them. Okay, what does this have to do with him, with Oedipus? However far anger ends up getting from its origin in the private, so long as it's couched in terms of some injury done to me, there's always a reminder that it's not completely objective. It's not a pure thing. Pure anger, however, gets to show itself in Oedipus because in speaking always, he thinks, for the city, he's allowed the illusion that he doesn't speak for himself. So perfect rule, Oedipus' understanding of his own rule, is impartial rule, selfless rule. It's like the rule of law. Justice must be blind. Interesting image in this play. But since the law doesn't rule by itself, what motivates a man to rule? Well, Creon gives one answer. Private gain in some sense, private satisfaction, that in a way must be the case. Oedipus represents what looks to be, what claims to be another answer, the man who takes his greatest satisfaction, his private satisfaction, in the suppression of the private. But remember always this, when he's talking to Tiresias, this strange thing that he says, do your duty, Tiresias, do it for the city, do it for me, for the city, and for yourself. It's a curious thing to say, because it's a kind of acknowledgement of the fact that he's not the same as the city, even though the whole pretense is that there's no distance between him and the city. That's what I meant by saying he's a spurious third. He needs that, but the fact that he talks about it in that way means that there is some satisfaction, there's some good for Oedipus that's not identical to the good of the city, despite the fact that he's always saying again and again, my soul suffers for all of you because I, in fact, feel all the pain that each one of you feels. So he presents himself as having a kind of purity which both distinguishes him and makes him identical to the citizens. And the problem is you can't have it both ways. So it looks as though you've got public and private, and it's as though Oedipus wants to say, and Oedipus doesn't acknowledge the distinction between the two, not for him, so it looks as though he wants to say he's completely public, but since everybody else has their public being only as a part of their being, this sort of elevates him above them and makes him distinct from them. So, and we saw this a bit last time, he seems to represent the danger of a human being who is completely satisfied with being virtuous. Sophocles identifies that sort of satisfaction, interestingly enough, with feeling anger. And he points to the fact that political life is, in a way, the outlet for it. This is the problem that dominates Plato's Republic. Now, with all of this in mind, let's turn to the end. Look at how Sophocles sets it up. Did Oedipus really commit incest and parricide? Well, in a way, the answer is pretty simple, no. To really have committed incest and parricide would have meant killing Polybus and sleeping with Merope. He kills somebody he doesn't even know and sleeps with someone he just met. So in a way, the point is that Sophocles makes these two crimes, these two most horrible crimes, as legalistic and as formal and as possible. Think about it for a minute. It looks as though when you've got Freud and you've got Sophocles, you say, well, Freud just worked it out in a more scientific way or in a more, way that's more immediately applicable to ordinary human beings or whatever. But it's precisely not Freud, because Oedipus ran away from Corinth so he wouldn't sleep with his mother and he wouldn't kill his father. He didn't want to sleep with his mother and kill his father, and he ends up sleeping with some woman whom he's just met and killing some man he never met before. So it's something interesting is going on. It is clearly meant to force you to think about what it would mean to kill your mother and your father, but it equally forces you to seek some deeper meaning, some other meaning for it, other than the fact that you are attracted to the first woman in your life and resent the man who actually makes you do what you don't want to do for the first however many years of your life. So why? Sophocles wants us to find equivalents for these crimes so as to prevent the play from turning into just a cruel joke. Now, we've seen for some time now that it all begins with the title, with the first words, Oedipus Tyrannus, right? So Oedipus the tyrant, and the double meaning of the word tyrant as on the one hand king and on the other hand tyrant, and then techna, children of Cadmus or of Oedipus, or both. So it is Oedipus in his tyranny, his kingship, who starts by treating those who are in fact his brothers and sisters, his equals, as though they are children, his inferiors. The play then seems to be about the way in which perfect devotion to the public sphere, to the exclusion of the private sphere, leads to tyranny. It's because Oedipus is really so good that he can't see himself. His swollen foot, his Oedipus, gets in the way of knowing where, Oedipu, he stands. Now, in a general sense, this has to do with his crimes, because by replacing his father in his mother's bed, he lives a metaphor for self-generation, for autonomy, for objectivity. Oedipus always sees three ways instead of two, because he doesn't see that he is what he is by virtue of already having taken one of those ways. And that the exception that you pointed to the last time, interesting, if you look, this is Jocasta. Yeah, I thought I heard you say that Laius was killed at a crossroads, but literally at a triple road, a parting of three ways. Yes, that's how the story went. Still, that word goes around. Where is this place, Jocasta, where he was murdered? Phocis is the country, and the road splits there, one of two roads from Delphi. So you see the interesting thing about that? At a place where three roads meet, so goes the story. So in effect, it is the exception that proves the rule, because she's getting an account of what happened. She's not imagining herself as on the road. So that's in a way what you see when you're in a book, in the same way that you can watch that wonderful scene the first time Darcy comes to ask Elizabeth to marry him in Pride and Prejudice. You're like a fly on the wall and you see the whole thing, and it's but you're not seeing it from her perspective or from his perspective, because it's so painful. You see that he's quite serious, even if he is a jerk and saying it in altogether the wrong way. So it is in a way the position that hearsay always puts us in. We're always acting as the third person omniscient narrator, but that ought to be the tip-off. Omniscience. This is why, we've all been reading the Poetics. It's why Aristotle says, well, it's interesting. I like epic. It's a fine form, and in fact, he will later say Homer is the best of the poets. But nevertheless, he also says drama is in a way superior. Why? Because it imitates the way you actually encounter people. It can't tell you what's going on inside their heads. It doesn't hover above. It's not talking about a parting of three ways. It gives you only your experience of people talking to one another, and therefore you are in a way at a crossroads, not at a parting of three ways. So it's more true to the actual situation, Aristotle wants to say. And in a way, what's interesting is that the only time in the play when anyone other than Oedipus says a parting of three ways is when Jocasta says, the story is this. And then she gives the account that she gives. He doesn't see that he came from somewhere, that he didn't just pop into existence, and therefore he does not know where he is, and thinks that he's nowhere, Oedipus. In specific, his rule parallels his crimes because both parricide and incest involve not acknowledging differences. They homogenize. They treat the father as though he's just another villain. They treat the mother as though she's just another love interest. So he was able to solve the riddle of the Sphinx because he could see the likeness, the footedness that underlay the differences. In a way, the problem is that Oedipus doesn't understand the ground which makes his own seeing possible. So, for example, he says children and sees everyone in the city but himself as a child without seeing that were he truly a stranger, he really would have to be a god in order to rule. Now, all of this we've seen before, different ways, but mostly we've seen it before. The crux of it seems to be this. Oedipus is in a way like an eye, an EYE, that sees so purely that it never notices its own perspective. If he were a little less perfect, any of you have these little things they call floaters in your eye? The little black marks that dart across your vision occasionally. If you don't, you will. It's one of the things that you're bound to get as you get older. These little motes in your eye. What's interesting is that you can be watching something and then this distraction comes along and all of a sudden you realize, oh, I'm seeing. Before that, you're seeing, and so of course you don't think about seeing. Or I remember the first time I noticed this. At first, it's kind of annoying. You go to a movie theater and there's some kind of defect or dent in the screen, and then the thing, comes on, and you constantly keep coming back to this thing that is not a part of the image. And if you obsess with it, of course, it's a constant reminder of the fact that you're in a movie, that you can't lose yourself as easily because of this little defect in the screen. It's like in that chorus earlier when the chorus used the word choreoane to remind you, oh, by the way, we're a bunch of not really that old people and we're dancing around on stage and we're a chorus. We're not really 12 old guys or 15 old guys who are the representatives of the people of Thebes. But Oedipus so genuinely identifies the good of Thebes with his own good that he neglects to notice that he has a good independent of theirs. So he never sees ambiguity. That's the source of the purity of his anger. It's therefore poetic justice that everything he says turns out to be literally true. He is incapable of uttering metaphor. Okay, but we still need to try to understand all of this in light of what happens when he does learn who he is. Now, Sophocles gives us several hints that the Oedipus of the end isn't so very different from the Oedipus at the beginning. As late as 1399, he's still talking about 3 roads. And probably most important, I've mentioned this before as early as the interviews for this class, but the unprecedented use, we're now at 1270, bottom of the page, bottom of my page. Let's start a little earlier. Bellowing terribly and led by some invisible guide, he rushed on the 2 doors, wrenching the hollow bolts out of their sockets. That's a preparation for where we're going, out of their arthra. Because, you have these doors and they are hinged, and on the top and the bottom, they fit into their sockets. There, we saw his wife hanging, the twisted rope around her neck. When he saw her, he cried out fearfully and cut the dangling noose. Then as she lay, poor woman, on the ground, what happened after was terrible to see. He tore the brooches, the gold-chased brooches fastening her robe, away from her, and lifting them up on high, dashed them on his own arthra, his own sockets, shrieking out such things as, "They will never see the crime I have committed or had done upon me." Now, that's an unprecedented. I don't know anywhere else in Greek where arthra is used to mean eye sockets or eyeballs. It is the word used back at 718 in the description of what happened to him when he was a baby. Start at 714. But see now, he, the king, was killed by foreign highway robbers at a, that's not what I want. No, as goes the story. And for the son, before 3 days were out, after his birth, King Laius pierced his arthra, and by the hands of others cast him forth. So, what he does to himself at the end is pierce his arthra, walk out of the room and say to Creon, "Throw me out on Mount Kithaeron." What his father did to him as an infant was pierce his arthra and say to another, "Throw him out on Mount Kithaeron." So he's once more taking the role of his father. In a much less direct way, but the meaning of that seems to become very clear. The last thing Creon says to him is, "Do not seek to be master in everything, for the things you master did not follow you throughout your life." So this is after Oedipus has been telling him what to do. "Exile me, do this to me." He says, "Cut it out. You're not the king. I have to go consult the god. I'm going to consult the god. I'm not going to simply do what I think I should do." So what might this mean? It has something to do with his reason for blinding and not killing himself. He blinds himself, we're told, so that he won't have to see his parents in Hades. So for Oedipus, sight still seems to be knowledge. There's still only the surface. Or you could put the whole thing a little differently. He's discovered that he didn't know who he was. He lacked knowledge of his own perspective. So far, so good. That seems to be sort of what we've been learning as well. He didn't know that he didn't know where. So what does he do? He blinds himself so that he will literally not know where. So for Oedipus, the alternatives seem to be seeing purely or not seeing at all. But for Oedipus, not seeing, means not being seen. Not to know where means to be nowhere. But this is just another version of claiming to occupy no perspective. Start over. You could say, a lot of people have seen this, drawn the wrong conclusion, I think. His solution to his plight is something like willing to be Tiresias, exercising his will, saying, I'm going to be blind. But Tiresias, the seer, was a blind man trying to see, to make the best of it. Oedipus wills his own blindness. He wills his own ignorance. So in terms of the split between public and private, you could say, he wills to become a private man. I resign my kingship, stick the pins in my eyes. Creon abandoned me on Mount Kithaeron, I'm done. I will have only the private world, and that will be my punishment. The privacy of the private world is the solution to his problem. It's in a way utterly public. It's a moralistic, it's like saying the private life is the solution. So, remember I had this, I told you this, I actually wrote my dissertation on this Platonic dialogue many years ago, the Philebus. I'm just going to repeat what I said because it somehow reveals what's going on here. Socrates is in an argument with a man named Philebus about whether the best life is a life of wisdom or the life of pleasure. And Socrates summarizes what separates them and then continues the argument, but he continues it with a follower of Philebus named Protarchus. And they engage in quite a long dialogue in which, of course, Socrates wins. But it turns out that Philebus, with whom Socrates was having the conversation previous to our participating in it, before the dialogue opens, falls asleep in the middle of the conversation. And you start thinking, well, why did he fall asleep? Well, he fell asleep because he's not really interested. And why isn't he interested? Well, because he really likes pleasures, and it's not pleasing to him, and he doesn't care who wins the argument, because to care who wins the argument about whether the best life is pleasure or wisdom is, in a way, by default, to say you need wisdom about whether pleasure is the good life in order for it to be the good life. But the whole point for him is, no, I pursue pleasures, small p. I don't pursue pleasures, capital P, pleasure as a way of life. That's not for me. I'm just a guy who likes his pleasures. And the minute I even say that, I've done something that's not really something I ought to be doing. I ought to be out there just pursuing my pleasures, but not telling you that I pursue pleasure, because that's to make it generic. As soon as I make it generic, Socrates wins, and his student, whose name means first principle, Protarchus, doesn't understand that. So in a way, you could say the contest at the beginning of the Philebus is the contest between the private life and the public life. And the representative of the private life falls asleep when the private life is no longer being credited. And what happens in the Oedipus Tyrannus is that Oedipus rejects the distinction between public and private. That's what, he is the city. It's only the public life, and then he discovers that he's been wrong. And so what does he do? He privatizes himself and it cuts himself off from the world by blinding himself, and says, exile me from the city. But it's all done in the spirit of what? Of morality, of the public. It's the solution to the problem. Whereas you would think that the private life, in a way, as you keep pushing, it's not an accident. I mean, I'm giving you one side of it here. You know what the word for the private man is in Greek? You do, right?
It's the idiot.
Idiotes, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so, yes.
That's not the idiot we use nowadays.
So, yeah, right. So if you're a private person, you're an idiot. Why are you an idiot? Well, because you're not really a human being, ultimately, because in a way, you're like Philebus. You fall asleep and you pursue pleasure with a small p rather. So it's not all one-sided here. There's nothing wrong, in a way, finally, with what Oedipus does. But in a way, you push it to the extreme and you see, oh, this is the problem with him. He can't somehow understand the incompleteness of his public understanding. He doesn't understand sufficiently that there's a tension between this perfect devotion to the public good and being a human being. So he wills to become a private man, but as soon as it's understood as a solution, it is really already, in a sense, still public. So Oedipus is really the same man at the end as he was at the beginning. The Oedipus Tyrannus moves from the parasite issue to the incest issue. Oedipus pretty much forgets the parasite when the incest comes up. He never even asks the herdsman about the discrepancy in the number of robbers. And of course, the plague still hovers over the city because of the murder, so he, in a way, literally forgets the city. Yet the two are, in a way, the same, the incest charge and the murder charge and the parasite charge. For human beings to try to be their own origin is to attack their origin. Oedipus claims to be, at line 1080, a child of fortune or a child of chance. But of course, that's actually not true. He's the child of Laius and Jocasta. You put it really very simply. What he ignores to the end is that the triple road is always a fork. In ignoring his own perspective, he treats himself as though he himself were no part of what he's seeing. Children of Cadmus, my children. And therefore, it's appropriate that the play should end the way it does. If you look at the last line, look upon that last day always. Count no mortal happy till he has passed the final limit of life, secure from pain. So this is a reflection on the fact that on the problem of grasping one's own life as a whole from within life. Where would you stand to grasp your life as a whole? To sum up your own life in an objective way, it looks as though you'd have to be dead to be able to do that, because otherwise your summing up of it would just be another example of an event in it, and it would be motivated by wherever you happen to stand at the time. You'd stand at a fork in the road and you'd be confronting that fork, and it looks as though that happens right up until the very last day. So to attempt to grasp it is necessarily just another moment in one's life that would itself have to be grasped in order to understand one's life as a whole. Turns out, I mean, Aristotle has a wonderful account of this in the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics, when in effect, he says, for example, that you can't count a whole life happy. And he cites as an example Priam of Troy, who probably thought he was pretty happy until in the last 10 years of his life, the Greeks besieged his city. They succeeded in the last year of that 10 years of conquering it, burning it down, raping his daughters and carrying them off, killing his sons and killing everybody else and killing him. Can you call that a happy life, even though he was the king of a prosperous city and had, 50 sons and equally numbered? And it would, so it turns out it ain't over until it's over. And that's the way life is. And Prime is a perfect example of that. So Aristotle says, you really can't sum it up. And then he goes on to say, but wait a minute, and we're talking about happiness in the first book of the Ethics. And then he says, but wait a minute, what about after you're dead? Can your life be ruined after you're dead? I mean, suppose you die and you're in Hades, and 15 years after you die, your granddaughter becomes a serial killer, and your name is brought into disrepute. Can you be retroactively made unhappy by that? And then Aristotle, in his usual very funny way, but nobody sees that it's funny, says, well, it depends on how long it is. If it's 18 generations, maybe you wouldn't be made unhappy. But if it's right away, that might really ruin your happiness as much as Priam's deal ruined his happiness. But the real meaning of this seems to be Aristotle reflecting on the fact that when you have lines like "count no man happy until he's dead," which means he can't sum up you can't sum up your own happiness until after you're dead. But then Aristotle asks the question, well, can you ever be happy then? You'd have to have a place where you could look back over your life and survey it as a whole. That's Hades or heaven, right? But then Aristotle says, well, wait a minute. You're still alive, and if you're alive, I mean, it's like the difference between, it's like graduate school. Hades is like graduate school. It can't be, in order to be able to sum up your life, you have to be alive, and if you're alive, you're still affected by it. You can't ever get out of that box. So it looks as though you can never have a complete understanding of your own life, and therefore, it doesn't mean you're miserable. It does mean that you can never stop and say, this is it. This is the happy life. I've arrived. And it looks as though this is Sophocles. This expression originally goes back to Solon. It's quoted, or invented by Herodotus in his histories. The notion that you count no man happy until he's dead. It looks as though it has something to do with a reflection on the fact that we can be very smart. We can discover a great deal about the world. None of these people are simply giving up on the distinction between the wise and the unwise, but you'd better be very, very hesitant to claim a kind of perfect lack of perspective that allows you to think that you have an utterly objective view of the world. And the interesting thing about this play, I think I mentioned this last time, is that Oedipus can only get away with that because he's so close to it. If he were very far away from it, it would just be preposterous and we'd laugh at him. There are plenty of people like that. We know people who think they know much more than they could possibly know. But Sophocles is at great pains in this play to show that he actually does know a great deal, and that in a way he gets so close to it is what allows him to go over the line and and think that he sees three roads when in fact he's always of necessity seeing only two. The problem with having parents is that you're never simply your own person. Physically even, you can see traits in you that come from one parent or another. You're a different person, but you're not simply a different person, both from the very beginning in terms, we would say, of your genetic makeup, but also in terms of having been raised by them, having been formed in a way by them. So the great irony of this teenage, we all felt it at one point or another. You get angry at your parents. Adolescence is really interesting for that reason. You just, sexually gotten to the point where it's possible for you to be a generator of your own family, and at the same time, you're part of the family you're living with, and so it's very tumultuous. You want to go out on your own, and yet you're also being ruled at the same time. You resent it, and it's interestingly possible for you to say, oh, I hate you, I wish you weren't my parents, and it's so crazy in a way, because if they weren't your parents, you wouldn't be who you are. You'd be somebody else, because you are who you are by virtue of the fact that, for better or worse, you grew up in a certain situation and they were the largest part of that situation you were in. That makes us feel incompletely in control. We want to rebel against the fact that we're not simply our own people. The metaphorical solution to that problem would be get rid of them. You have to still be born. You get rid of your father, if you're a male, kill him, and take his place in your mother, in his marriage bed, which means you are, in a way, metaphorically, the origin of yourself. You're self-caused. Now, of course, it's not true. I mean, because you can't even work out a metaphor that's a perfect image of it, but this is a metaphor that comes as close as possible to a version of being autonomous, a law to yourself, created by yourself, with no antecedents, no one behind you to make you what you are. You are your own father in a way that, now you'd have to work it out. Of course, they worked it out in terms of the male. In terms of the female, it would have to be killing the mother and having intercourse with your father, I guess. Freud tries to do that with the Electra complex. It's much harder since Agamemnon's dead. But it is interesting that we already saw in the Agamemnon, the way in the Libation Bearers, the way they try to bring him back to life at the beginning. And also in Sophocles' Electra, there's a sense in which this powerful attraction to the father and hatred of the mother looks as though it might be understood as a similar kind of metaphorical attempt to be your own person. But I don't think it works as well. And I think part of the reason it doesn't work as well, it's a reflection on their part on what they think of as the difference between male and female. And this has to do with the difference between the natural and the political. And in some way, I think they're understanding the political as the outlet for the human attempt to take control of your life and not be subject to the whims of other things. So this will come up especially in the first Stavzimon and the Antigone. The Denos character of human beings has to do with the attempt the attempt to take control of the world and not let it affect you, to be, in a way, autonomous. And of course, for them, the political is the male realm. I think that there's something wrong with that. We know there's something wrong with that, but you also don't want to read it the wrong way. These tragedians are constantly developing a critique of the political as having within it the tendency to overstep. It has such a longing for autonomy, for self-rule, for the human control of the human, as opposed to being at the mercy of natural things, that they think that the attempt to perfect that leads to tragedy. That's what these tragedies are about. The tragedy of the political is that it becomes absolutized. You think you can change everything. You think that you can develop a system which will so completely remove you from the natural that you won't be subject to it at all. And they identify that with what you might call, they wouldn't put it in this way, and this is a little too flip, they identify that with what you might call a male fantasy. So yes, they make the distinction between male and female. They use the female as a symbol of the natural, the male as a symbol of the political, but they do that in order to criticize the political. And so in a way, in the plays we've read so far, the far deeper strand, although very hard to articulate, has been for them the natural, and therefore the feminine. I don't want to use that. I mean, as I say, I think that's problematic, but to understand them, you have to understand what they're doing with that symbolism, and what they're doing with it is really interesting. Because even if you drop the male-female angle, it does look as though we recognize these types, in a way, a willingness to understand one's necessary incompleteness on the one hand, and an unwillingness to accept that, attempt to fly to heaven and have your wings melted and fall into the sea. The Phaeton story in Greek mythology. You don't need to do it male and female. You could do it, Jerusalem and Athens. That's one way to do it too. One says turn the other cheek, and one says, take control. Neither of them does that purely. But the great problem in the Jerusalem end of it is the thing that you're always being slapped down for, is one kind of hubris or another, a certain kind of attempting to be like God. So where you have gods, you always have two possibilities. If you take gods to be the symbol of this kind of autonomy and perfection that in one way we long for, you could say, if you have gods, you can either emulate them or be afraid of them. And in some way, you've got to be both, right? You've got to be both. So they either provide models for imitations. That looks as though it's more prominent in Greek things, in Athens, or obedience, because a realization that you can't, and that looks as though it's more prominent in Judaism and then Christianity, so Jerusalem, Athens. That tension it's easy to understand that tension in some way parallels this tension that we've been seeing between female on the one hand, male on the other, natural on the one hand, political on the other. That was probably more than you wanted.